Thank you. Thank you very much, and thank you for being here, because as you've just seen, this is very important for us as a university because we want to reach out to as many people as possible, but it's also very important for some of our students who are helped to be here and to pursue their research and their careers through the Kent Opportunities Fund. So thank you for contributing. Now, I cannot quite remember when I first met our guest tonight, but I do remember when I first read this, which is...
drivel, honestly. They'll publish any old nonsense.
He wrote this a few years ago. It's called Chavs, the Demonisation of the Working Class. He's 15 now. Because I was born in Clydeside, and the people in my family rolled steel, or they dug coal, or they made ships. And I kind of wondered what happened to these kind of heroes of my childhood who suddenly were transformed, at least in certain newspapers and partly in our public debate, to these feckless people who didn't pull their weight, were job shy and work shy and so on. And so Chavs, for me, was a revelation, and I enjoyed reading it greatly. Owen Jones, as you'll all know, is a democratic socialist, a writer, a campaigner, and I mean this as a compliment. He's a bit of a stirrer as well. But he's also very polite and a very, very fine debater. Please we welcome Owen Jones. And welcome to Canterbury, which, as you may know, for the first time in 100 years, elected a Labour MP.
The People's Republic of Canterbury. Well done, everyone. Well done.
Why did we do it? I suspect it may have something to do with the students here and others. But why do you think we did it?
Well, exactly. No, but I think that point there is a really critical point. I think, obviously, young people in this election had a pretty decisive role. And for years, under the Conservatives, there was this sense, and other politicians to be fair, there was this sense that young people simply will not come out and vote. We can do whatever we want. We can treble their fees, we can get rid of the education and maintenance allowance, we can slash their youth services, we won't build the housing they need, we can slash their benefits, we can discriminate against them in the minimum wage, we won't provide them with skilled, secure jobs, etc. But they won't come out and vote. And they did, and they roared, and they did have a big role to play. And what's interesting is there's this narrative that young people start off as these idealistic, left-wing radicals, and then they become, as reality bites, they shift to the right. But in 1983, when Margaret Thatcher won her landslide victory, the Tories had a 9-point lead amongst 18 to 24-year-olds. At the moment, Labour has a 52-point lead in the same group. And that's unprecedented in history. And, again, there was this sense since the election, and it's funny because the left sometimes is accused of being, you won't win outside the core vote, but now the argument is Labour won too many middle-class voters, which can't stick to the same, at least stick to a line of argument. But the most supportive were young working-class people. That was the group, not students. I mean, there are many working-class students, but people who weren't students, who were working-class, they were actually the most supportive of Labour. But what's also interesting is, amongst people who are 35 to 44, often have mortgages midway through their career, have kids, Labour had a 20-point lead. So, the idea that places like Canterbury or the People's Republic of Kensington, which, suddenly shifted to Labour simply because of young people, though young people played an inspiring role. I saw it knocking on doors, talking to people, ringing up their grandparents, spreading the message in lots of different ways. But the idea that somewhere like Canterbury could only be won because of students is obviously just fantastical. It was won because people of all ages, and both working class and middle class people, were inspired by a vision which has not been offered up to the British public for many.
Why do you think the result was, for some people, including a lot of people in the Labour Party, such a surprise?
Well, for including people who in the leadership. I mean, I think there were three factors. I think one was, look, back in that different political era that was April, things looked well, it was a completely different political era. I mean, things looked very bad. The Tories had twice the polling of Labour. Labour just lost the first by-election of an opposition party since 1981. Even in the elections, the local elections were bad. And historically, The share you get in a local election before a general election is actually, you end up getting a lower vote in the general election. It was 27% for Labour, and who ended up getting 40% a few weeks later. And I think there were three main factors. One, broadcasting rules kicked in. Jeremy Corbyn had been systematically demonised as an extremist. He was linked to Al-Qaeda, was going to nationalise everyone's children. And I think
there's some people who think that might be a good idea, actually.
And I think when he was able to have, and this was my fear, that he wouldn't, that people make an impression historically, and it's very difficult to change it. But when he went on television and people saw him as he was, and he didn't just have these little snippets, we didn't have the Daily Mail portraying him as, this evil, sinister extremist, people changed their mind. And I think that was definitely one factor. Another factor was the grassroots operation on the ground, and I saw that across the country. I went to about 30 different constituencies, and it was astonishing watching people who'd never knocked on a single door in their entire life, knocking on doors, reaching people, because they felt inspired by a vision which, hadn't been offered up for a very long time. And that's the most important factor above all else.
But were you still surprised, when you heard the... you were...
Well, on the manifesto, the most important point, though, was the manifesto. There was no question at all. If you look in that general election, the turning point, and I remember I was on Sky News and it was leaked, and they suddenly went, the entire Labour manifesto's been leaked out. What do you think about this? And I was like, I haven't really read it. I didn't know what's going on. But it was at the time. It was horrifying, and the leadership operation were horrified as well.
But was it your manifesto that was leaked, or was it because the Conservatives were an absolute shambles?
No, I think there's been too much emphasis on just. It was embarrassing. Don't get me wrong. It was very embarrassing. The Tories just imploded in lots of ways. But don't forget, there were 2 terrorist attacks during this general election, which traditionally, these are horrifying events, but you think would help particularly a Conservative Party, which was trying to portray its opposition as terrorist sympathisers in the most slanderous way imaginable. I think actually, as bad as what the Tories did were, Theresa May started off with more political capital than any Prime Minister in British history. She had higher ratings than Tony Blair at his very peak. Let's not forget. I think the manifesto on the doorstep, no question whatsoever, when people suddenly heard ideas like taxing those who are doing well to invest in the economy, public ownership of utilities, a genuine living wage, the abolition of debt, punishing young people for daring to dream to a university education. All of those things turned people around. They said, I wasn't so keen on them before. I wasn't so keen on that Jeremy, but I like those ideas. And overall, every single person who knocked on a door and noted on the ground that shift, and it was there, it was very clear on the ground, it was because of that inspiring alternative vision to a social order, which I'm sure we'll talk about, a social order in this country which is bankrupt, which doesn't work, which in the same way of the post-war consensus of the 1970s was disintegrating, this one is disintegrating.
That to me is the really big point. Yeah. I noticed today in the Financial Times had a series of top business people saying effectively some of the things that they wouldn't quote Jeremy Corbyn, I would suspect, but they said things are not working, capitalism is not working for everybody, it's not the rising tide that will lift all boats that John F. Kennedy talked about and people have bought into since 1963 when he said it, that doesn't work. Now, if you've got people, senior business people saying that, they are trying to reinvent capitalism. Are you trying to reinvent capitalism?
Well, who am I? I'm just some
prepubescent,
I'm some poor man's, some pound shop Macaulay Culkin lookalike. He writes, all sorts of drivel. No, I think what, in terms of the left, is trying to do is what the right did in the 1970s. There was a crisis in the 1970s caused by the oil shock. You had massive inflation, stagnating economic growth, and the right at the time said the post-war consensus, state intervention in the economy, nationalisation, strong trade unions, high tax on the rich. We're gonna get rid of all of it, and they had a narrative: we'll unleash the individual and liberate the individual from the dead hand of the state. And their big symbolic kind of event, which the centerpiece of that narrative was the winter of discontent. Bodies not being buried and rubbish not being collected, the tyranny of collectivism. The individual will be liberated. In the same way now, this consensus of Thatcherism, deregulation, privatisation, the smashing of the trade unions, low taxes on the rich, is self-evidently collapsing. You talk about the FT. There was a former Cameron advisor in the FT the other week talking about the calamitous failure of water privatisation. You know, I mean, talking about how water privatisation had failed was something that the left hadn't even talked about for a very long time. And that is because the social model we have is bankrupt. It means it's provided, in the last few years, the worst squeeze in living standards, according to those well-known lefties, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, the worst squeeze in living standards since the 1750s. It's meant a housing crisis, which has meant millions of people can't get decent, affordable homes. It's meant young people are going to have a worse lot in life than their parents, the first time that's happened in generations. It's meant many old people are condemned to a retirement of insecurity and hardship. We could go on, the slashing of services, the NHS plunged into a humanitarian crisis, according to the British Red Cross. And if the winter of discontent summed up the breakdown of that consensus, then I think Grenfell Tower sums up the collapse of this order. Because what that showed was working class people for many years who spoke out and said that a disastrous fire would happen and people would die, and that was what it would take for people to be listened to, where cladding was chosen, which was cheaper and flammable, where, you know, regulations weren't imposed, where sprinklers weren't introduced, because we live in an order which prioritises profit over not just the needs and aspirations of people, but their lives. And I think that is the fact. You know, Jim Callaghan said when he was Labour Prime Minister on the eve of Thatcher assuming power, he said, sometimes the tide of history just shifts. And there's nothing really you can do or say.
Mrs. Thatcher said the same thing in the 1970s. She said the tide of history is with us, and she was right for it.
And I think, and it's not to be, the danger is, of course, the complacency, because they've not lost. They didn't, no one won the last election. That's why we have a hung parliament. But the Tories obviously got 42%, Labour got 40%. You know, from a base 6 weeks before of everything in there, you know, the Tories were going to get, I don't know, a majority of 1 million or something. 1 million seats in Parliament. They'd have to extend Parliament to add all the new seats the Tories were going to get. No, but I mean, Wembley Stadium is going to become the new House of Parliament for all the Tory MPs. Yeah, I mean, you know, given where we started, it was, you know, the biggest increase in Labour's share of the vote since 1945 under Climate Attlee. Now, I think what that showed is, you know, the Tories clearly, you know, and I think we still see in the opinion polls, there's a kind of Cold War, two warring blocs at the moment. The Tories are still around 40%. It's often older people, people who are fearful of a dramatic shift in the way our societies run. But at the moment, you can see the Tories accepting, you know, Sajid Javid, the cabinet minister, is talking now about borrowing £50 billion to build housing. They were demonising Labour for years for proposing those sorts of ideas. The tide is with the ideas that the left has proposed for years.
And there's no doubt that many people are energised, Brexit and a lot of other things. But let me put to you, one of the problems with politics in this country has always been, both Labour and the Conservatives, we know, are a coalition of interests. And there are people, perhaps there are people in this audience, who think one of the problems with politics is, within the Conservative Party, people hate each other more than they hate Labour, and within Labour there are people who actually hate each other, including hate the leadership. And that is true within the Parliamentary Labour Party as well. In other words, the party's system, you may be right in talking about these big ideas and the changes, but when we look at the kind of what goes on at Westminster, and we listen to politicians loathing people within their own party, that is not very inspiring in very, very difficult times.
Well, I mean, we say that, but actually, look, I support proportional representation, partly because I think, you know, people are forced often to vote for, you know, the less of two evils and all the rest of it. But people like me have to have some humility, because the combined share of the two main parties is the highest since 1970. And the whole argument for proportional representation was that politics was fragmenting, UKIP, Lib Dem, SNP, Greens, Plaid Cymru, all the rest. That has gone into reverse. And I suspect actually what you'll see within, you know, to be brutally honest, the vast majority of people in the country, according to every poll going, support public ownership of all the utilities, higher taxes on the rich. Basically, you know, Corbyn's manifesto. There are elements of the Parliamentary Labour Party, and you have to divide them up. There were some who said or thought, I like these ideas, but they're being incompetently executed. There were others who said, I like these ideas, but put them all together, the public will never vote for them, in some. And there were others, and I think they actually are a relatively small minority of MPs, who said, I don't think they're popular, I think they're electoral poison, but I also don't agree with them. And Tony Blair is very much in that mould. He said it himself. It's not just that he didn't think a left-wing Labour Party was electorally viable, he didn't want it to be electorally viable. He thought it would be a bad thing for the country, which he's made clear. I think that element of the Labour Party, that parliamentary Labour Party, is now isolated. And I think actually a lot of people, a lot of MPs, and I know this, some of them had tears in their eyes afterwards, some who were very hostile to the project, not just to Jeremy, but the idea of having a left-wing-led Labour Party, which was they were delighted to wake up, or not wake up, they probably stayed up all night in accounts, but they were delighted to find out that actually politics has shifted in this country. I suspect it's different in the Tory party now because a lot of it is driven by personality rather than ideology at the moment within the Tories. But they clearly have very acrimonious divisions over Brexit, the way it's going to be executed. And, at the moment, it's like a Quentin Tarantino film, the Tories. I mean, it's how it's going to end. I mean, hopefully not for the country, the way it's going, but I think actually the internal divisions within the Labour Party in terms of its membership are almost non-existent. Within the parliamentary Labour Party, I think they've massively diminished since the election because of what's happened. But at the same time, within the Tories, clearly, they're like the Labour Party of the 70s, which is accepting the consensus they'd established is falling to pieces and just not knowing what to do about it.
Now, I want to throw open to audience questions in just a moment, but just one other point before that. It has been said of the election result about Labour that many people voted for Labour because there was a genuine alternative and all the reasons you gave. Another analysis is nobody actually believed that Jeremy Corbyn was going to win, and they didn't believe he was going to do any of the things that he said. For example, cutting back fees that students have to pay. It was never going to happen. In fact, although I met Andy Burnham recently, Mayor of Greater Manchester, who was saying, he wasn't talking about university fees, but what he was saying was there are 38,000 5-year-olds who've started school in Greater Manchester this month, in September, and about a third of them have not got much of a chance because they come from homes where there isn't very much money, where they are perhaps not speaking English the way that it would be necessary for them to integrate completely. And he meant including people who are English for generations because of the way in which they're brought up. And he said, that's where we should be spending the money. So in other words, the big point was that Labour promised a lot of things, but nobody expected that it would be delivered, and that was one of the reasons people voted for Labour.
That is a thesis which has definitely been widely promoted, but there's not a shred of evidence to back it up. All the research that's been done, they've done these mega polls of voters, and there's no higher proportion of, they found very few Labour voters who voted on the basis, well, I'll vote this way, but I really don't want him to become Prime Minister. That was almost non-existent. Only 6% of people voted on the basis of who the local MP was, because there's this whole idea that people voted for anti-Corbyn MPs or anti-left MPs. So there's no evidence to back that up in the polling itself. That Lord Ashcroft, who's a Tory, former vice chair, all the research that has been done since the election, there's none to suggest that. And indeed, in the polling itself, if that was the case, you'd expect Labour's polling to go down quite dramatically. Labour's polling is higher now than it was in their election result.
But wasn't it a Santa Claus manifesto? We're going to do this for you. We're going to do, everything. The trains are going to run better. Everything's going to be fantastic. Nobody believed that.
Well, they did. Otherwise, they wouldn't have voted that way. I think it was a vote of hope. It was a vote of optimism, and I think actually, what I found myself, just anecdotally, but from talking to others and also what the research suggests, is people voted the way they did often because of ideas and policies which they were delighted to hear all of a sudden, because it was already the common sense of the British public. The polling shows 80% of people want water to be brought back into public ownership.
Including a majority of Conservatives.
Indeed,
voters.
Conservatives want the railways renationalised. UKIP voters, those well-known frothing at the mouth lefties, they all want the utilities brought back under public ownership. So what I would suggest to you actually is what Labour did, unless they had proposed a manifesto, which it was a direct rebuke to this whole dogma which has which has underpinned our society, which is there is no alternative. People never bought in, really, to the idea we should privatise the railways, that rich people should pay very little tax relatively, we should slash corporation tax on big businesses and banks. There was never any public enthusiasm for those policies. There was resignation, certainly, and acquiescence on the basis
And
there is no alternative.
apathy as well, because
And
people didn't want to vote because they didn't think there was a real
They
alternative.
thought, well, I always prefer resignation to apathy. I mean, I found that, I go to schools a lot, still a lot of the youngest person there, no joking. No, but when you go there, you find this sense of resignation, this sense of young people I always found were very political. They were very enthusiastic about issues. They had hopes and dreams and fears and insecurities that were all political. They never connected them formally to politics, certainly not. But I think what has changed in this country is this sense of there is no alternative, that you should be resigned to a social order which has delivered stagnating and falling wages, a lack of affordable housing, deteriorating public services, a worse lot of life for young people than those who came before them. All of those things, they're not inevitable. They're not acts of God. They're not like the weather. It's not like the rain. You complain about it raining, nothing you can do about it. These are all conscious acts. And I think what has changed in this general election is the scales have fallen from a lot of people's eyes, and they suddenly realised that actually you don't have to grit your teeth. You don't have to accept the way this country is run. And I think it will be very difficult to put the genie back in the bottle. I think, frankly, now, increasingly, millions of people, including people I've met who voted Tory in 2015, who voted UKIP, who voted Lib Dem, and who didn't vote at all, they now think to themselves, hang on a minute, we don't have to settle for this. And it's not about, they say it's electoral bribery, giving people what they want, which I always found astonishing. What I think the reality is, finally, this consensus which has run this country since the late 1970s is falling to pieces. And the issue now, and it is up to the people in this room, is to build a movement that can finally ensure we get a government that does all the things which I think the majority of people in this country want.
And just on that point, I mean, we've been talking now for 25 minutes, so when we came in, Theresa May was still Prime Minister. It may have changed.
Never know.
If anybody.
Never know.
I mean, but you don't. I mean, that's one of the things. It is so uncertain. If I said to you there's going to be a general election next year, it might sound fantastical, but you couldn't entirely rule it out, could you? You can't rule out anything at the moment.
I always found that the last couple of years, every time you get a news alert, you kind of adopt the brace position. All right, 2017, what have you done this time? I mean, obviously we live in an age of unpredictability. I mean, what has been, I suppose, from the political views I've had, the problem was until this election, is that when things were surprising according to the general consensus, they were never in the favour of people like myself. Brexit happened and Donald Trump happened, but they weren't things which obviously I was happy about. This election was different because it was unpredictable in a way that favoured obviously a vision of society which is not about blaming immigrants for all the ills of society. It's not about blaming Muslims. It's not about blaming unemployed people. It was about holding the powerful vested interest to account, who I think have plunged this country into a series of terrible disasters, but also building a society running the interest of the majority. But you're right, this is an age now of unpredictability, and I do think, and one of the things I'm involved in at the moment is this unseat campaign where on Sunday we're targeting Boris Johnson's constituency. His majority fell in the last election from 10,500 to 5,000. Ian Duncan Smith went from 8,500 to 2,500. It could go on, but you can't be complacent, and that's why it's correct to operate now as though we're in a permanent general election campaign, because to coin a phrase, we don't know when this coalition of chaos will fall and when we can finally get strong and stable government under Labour and Jeremy Corbyn. So we have to organise now. That's the point.
I wonder how strong and stable worked last time. Anyway, let's maybe we could put the lights up a little bit. And let's.
We can't see anyone, by the way.
Can't see anyone.
This could be an empty
There's
room with
nobody
just
here.
like a lapping laughter.
Right. Who'd like to be first? Yes, gentleman up there.
Yes, good evening, Owen.
Hello.
Like you, I too have been a democratic socialist all my life.
Where are you from, by the way?
South Wales Valleys originally.
Ah, very good. Yeah, my old housemate's from the Rhondda. Are you from near the Rhondda? Or?
I am from the Rhondda.
From the Rhondda. He was from near Torney Pandy. Sorry, everyone. Sorry, just having a little chit.
I'm from a village.
Family, my dad's family are from the Llyn Peninsula in North Wales, so I hope that doesn't
I'm aware
cause
of
any
that,
bad blood.
yes.
Oh. Oops.
I joined the Labour Party 67 years ago.
Wow. Big round of applause for people who support Labour in the room.
My attitude hasn't changed. What I would ask is, do you feel that the interest and determination and the initiatives that we are seeing from the younger people, are generated to a great extent by the different sorts of media that we now have. Because in my day, it was a question of standing at the Pithead gates selling the Labour Party League of Youth newspaper. But now, of course, it's a different kettle of fish. And I'm encouraged to see so many young people here tonight. It's a good thing. It's our future. And I'd like to just ask you what you think about the progression that has been made is due to the type of media that we have.
Owen?
That definitely has played a part. Look, we're often told we have a free press, which is true. You know, we're not, you know, the government doesn't control the press. We're not North Korea, not a very ambitious place to start, to be fair. And I don't want to be flippant there, because journalists are persecuted and tortured and imprisoned and murdered in other countries. But we do have a press which is overwhelmingly run by a very small group of very rich media moguls who obviously help determine what's seen as politically acceptable, and they demonise, humiliate and ignore those who deviate from a political consensus which ultimately they benefit from. And that's always been a challenge for the left in terms of getting a message across, because millions of people get their information overwhelmingly from a press which also sets a lot of the priority, the news priorities of the broadcast media. And I think what social media has done, and I think Facebook more than Twitter, by the way, has meant that it is possible to reach huge numbers of people. And what I found interesting, I actually interviewed one of the people who ran the Tories social media campaign after this election. And he found that one of the challenges the Tories ended up with, and they're not used to disadvantages, let's be fair, is that dozens of third-party groups, that's pro-Labour or anti-Tory groups, registered and used Facebook to disseminate information, and the Tories didn't have any of that. And I think the most striking example was Momentum, which is the grouping which supports, I suppose, the left of the Labour Party in the leadership, is that some of their videos, were seen by up to 1 in 4 of the British electorate. So obviously they went viral, their content. I found during my own Facebook groups just jumped dramatically during the election. People were suddenly politically very interested. They wanted to see an alternative. The press overwhelmingly, the Telegraph, the Times, the Sun, the Express, we could go on, the Mail, overwhelmingly ran a vicious, vitriolic campaign against the Labour Party. And I think actually this election could be a turning point in that it broke the back of their power. I think they have played very, very decisive roles in the past. But the Sun newspaper, for example, in 2010 had sold 3 million copies a day. It's now down to 1.7 million. And online, it's just not really a thing. So I think what has happened is online, the left has got a much better game because it has a grassroots basis and that has reached people. I think the old press, which has been used often to promote the way things are and to get people to be angry, often about immigrants and unemployed people and all the rest, its power has been diminished. It's not completely changed. I still think they play a role, and people aren't robots or children. They make their own decisions up. They're not just told what to do by Rupert Murdoch. I wouldn't say that. But it's definitely the case that social media, particularly amongst younger people, not just people who are in their 20s and teens, but older than that, definitely played a role in terms of registration. About 2.5 million people registered to vote after the election was called. Not all, some of them might have already been registered, but it's still a big, big jump. Whether it be turnout in places like this. I'd be interested to see a show of hands. Who saw on social media Momentum videos or pro-Labour videos or? Yeah, I mean, there you go. I mean, it was dramatic during the election, and in the 80s that just wasn't a thing. You had the press and you had the BBC and ITV, and that was it. So I think that is a dramatic shift, and I think that explained the increase in turnout, particularly amongst younger people, and the surge that happened towards Labour. So yes, it played a role. It's only part of the story, but it's an important part of the story.
Thank you. Some more thoughts. There's a few people in the middle. Maybe we can get some microphones to them.
Hello there.
Hello.
I'm Bill Balkett. I'm the website news editor of Inquirer, the university newspaper. The question I want to ask you is, Theresa May saying that she'll freeze tuition fees of 9,250, or the Labour Party and Jeremy Corbyn saying they'll scrap university tuition fees completely. Which is more desperate?
Well, Theresa May, quite obviously. I mean, I think the problem the Tories have now is they accept that the consensus that they've supported, that they introduced in the late 70s, is falling to pieces. And the dilemma is, and that's particularly amongst people under 65, where it's virtually collapsed, where the Tories are a fringe, when Labour, amongst 18 to 24-year-olds, the Tories on 12% now, and Labour on about 65%. So they have a big problem structurally, because the evidence suggests the first party you vote for, you're more likely to vote for the rest of your life. In terms of turnout, that should be, there was an increase in youth turnout, but that should be the floor for Labour at the next election, not the ceiling. And, a lot of those people vote again, but they'll encourage other people to do the same. I think what their dilemma is, do we double down on ideology, which is the view of some of them? We've just not made the case for free markets and how great they are, and we need to go out there and enthuse people with that ideology. Or is it a case to go, well, actually, no, this is broken the way things are at the moment? And actually, Theresa May did kind of accept that. I mean, when she stood on Downing Street as Prime Minister for the first time, she talked about the burning injustices. She was doing that. But the problem with that is you start legitimising the worldview of your entire opposition. And they say to themselves, well, why would I vote Corbyn light when I could get the full thing? And I think the problem is by freezing tuition fees, which has a financial cost attached to it, but it has no political traction. The idea that if tuition fees were a big burning issue that helped determine your vote, you're going to go, well, the Tories have promised 9,250 tuition fees, Labour offering nothing, then obviously I don't think you're going to go necessarily for Theresa May there. So it's a sign of desperation. It's a sign of them saying, we know we have a problem here, but we don't know what to do. If we do a token effort like this, it will help diffuse the problem. There was a headline today in the Times, Theresa May doubles numbers of tweets in effort to win over the young vote. I mean, do you know what? I'm just not convinced. So I think it's the same with the energy cap. They said they'll introduce one, then they won't, then they will. Now they're saying they won't again. I think that the problem is they're torn between going double down on supporting free markets and these policies, or start conceding ground, and they're flitting between the two desperately, and that's their problem at the moment.
Thank you. Maybe we could pass to, yeah.
And I'm interested to know what you think about votes at 16, because it's due to be debated in Parliament on November the 3rd, and I'm interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, I support votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. What I'd support is a quid pro quo, actually, which is that I think we should have at school compulsory politics taught, citizens' education, whatever you want to call it, to inform people about how their democracy works. Anyone who's gone campaigning and knocking doors will know that there are many people who don't actually know how to vote. And I know it sounds to some absurd, but they genuinely don't. They don't understand the democratic system. They don't understand the basics of politics. And in a sense, why would they, a lot of people? I mean, that disproportionately affects people who often need democracy more than most people. So I think what I would say is at schools, we should have compulsory education to teach people. I mean, just about the act of voting would be helpful, but about politics, about democracy, about how it works, about the role of being a citizen, your rights, your responsibilities, and all the rest. And the quid pro quo is to give votes for 16 and 17-year-olds. If you can die fighting for your country, if you can have a family, if you can have a job, if you can pay taxes, then of course you should be able to have a say in deciding who's will govern you and help decide your future. For me, it's an obvious point. So yes, votes for 16 and 17-year-old citizens, and also let's introduce education in schools so people are informed about how democracy works.
Thank you. There's a couple more up at the top there, and is there anybody on the far right who'd like to say anything?
Not politically.
Yes, there's a lady, but we'll come to you in a moment.
People suddenly goose-stepping out. No.
I'm talking geography rather than politics, obviously. Yes.
Yeah, so quick question. Do you think that there's a danger because the left is so behind Jeremy Corbyn and the leadership of the Labour Party that there isn't as much of a sort of a left movement that's there to hold their feet to the fire on certain issues like free movement of people, like higher personal taxation, like proportional representation, that kind of thing?
Yeah, I suppose, I mean, it's a difficult, I mean, I do think what's important with any political movement is you have outriders and critics, and I suppose outriders are people who say you're not going far enough on certain issues and you need to go further, and critics are people who go, hold on a minute, this isn't necessarily working, we need to deal with this. Because I suppose, because the odds were so stacked against Labour, and this was one of the biggest political upsets in modern Western history, certainly of an advanced democracy, there's a sense, in terms of, a party led by what would, I don't like to say radical left, because I think, as I've said, it represents the common sense of millions of people, but relatively, of course it is, historically that hasn't really happened before, and I think a lot of people clearly afterwards were so both relieved but just triumphalist. These were people in April who were going to wipe Labour out as a political force as far as they were concerned. They were going to extinguish Labour. We're going to have some de facto one-party state. The Tories are going to rule till 3028 with spaceships everywhere or whatever, privatised spaceships, no doubt. But it was that kind of genuine, that sense of relief, and we're still in that honeymoon period. But I think it is important, clearly, that people do hold their feet to the fire over it. On freedom of movement, I signed the Labour campaign for freedom of movement, and the reason I did that is because, in good faith, having spent years arguing that EU citizens, who are our neighbours, who are our nurses, our doctors, who are our friends, our colleagues, our lovers, in some cases, the idea that they in any way should be scapegoated for the ills of the powerful, the bankers who plunge this country into terrible disaster, the tax dodgers who won't pay their taxes, the poverty-paying bosses in a country where most people in poverty and work, earning their poverty, that any attempt to redirect blame from those vested interests to the people who help prop up our economy, who contribute to us in so many ways, culturally, in terms of to friendships, to whatever, is for me just anathema. I can't do that. I understand the political problem, but in good faith, I can't concede that argument. And I understand the bind the Labour leadership are in on that, but I still would argue that freedom of movement within the EU has been a good thing for this country. And I can't, and it's easy to say, well, because the majority of people in this country don't believe that. They really don't. And that is an argument I appreciate has been lost it shouldn't be lost. It depends how you phrase it, of course, because I think that's very interesting you say that, because I think, the problem the left often has is the right will often, and George Lakoff, a political linguist in America, argues this, the right often use stories to make a point, and the left use facts and statistics. So, I remember, one of the arguments in support of freedom of movement at the EU is repeated studies have shown that EU immigrants pay in more than they get back from the state for lots of reasons. They tend to be younger and so on, and they tend more likely to be in work and so on. But Nigel Farage came back and said, well, there's more important things than money, isn't there? What about community? And that was trolling on an epic scale, because he was trying to show the left are these money-obsessed neoliberals, and I'm standing for community. But it is, and I always argued we should talk, I talk about my grandparents. I'm sure many of you have relatives who, or many of you have, depended on the NHS. And, my grandma worked for the NHS since it was founded. She loved the NHS, she cared for the NHS, and the NHS cared for her in her final weeks. And she was looked after by Latvian nurses and Polish doctors and Lithuanian care workers and all the rest. And I think, for me, that emotional story is very important, and we need to continue making that case. Because in good faith, for me, whatever the political convenience, I cannot look anyone in the eye and say that freedom of movement in the EU has been a bad thing, even though I know many of the people I grew up with take the opposite case in a place in Stockport where there are very few immigrants. And it was often the places with the least immigrants who felt that the most strongly. But I can't do it. And I think, that argument does need to be made. That's why I signed up to that campaign. I know what the political bind is. I understand the political dilemma. But the one thing, whatever people think about freedom of movement, the one thing we can't do is throw under the bus people who this country depends on. Millions of people who feel uncertain and scared, who've been scapegoated by a vile, disgusting press, by the Conservative Party to try and deflect from the people who bankroll them, who actually did plunge this country into disaster. So whatever your view on that, all of us need to make the case in the coming weeks, months and years in this tawdry process with the Tories messing everything up, and turning us into an international laughingstock, that we depend on EU immigrants. They prop our economy up. They're our friends, our neighbours, our lovers, and we will never let them be scapegoated for what the bankers and the tax dodgers and all the rest of them do.
Come back for another couple of questions. We've had some emailed in, and there's one which is on a similar theme, Owen, which is the difficulties of the Labour Party on certain issues, and it's the Brexit issue more widely. And someone's emailed in, is it right for the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, to suggest on behalf of UK Labour a second Brexit referendum if the UK Parliament rejects the deal? I mean, in other words, how do you see Labour in opposition handling all this? Because it's very difficult for some of the reasons you've just said. Some Labour voters find freedom of movement very difficult.
They do, and what I'd say, I mean, first of all, we've got to remember this was a mess caused by the partisan interest, the disastrous, self-destructive partisan interest of the Conservative Party. Do you remember that tweet David Cameron sent on the eve of the 2015 election? The choice is clear between chaos with Ed Miliband or stability with the Conservatives. We've just had stability coming out of our ears ever since 2015, the most stable, tranquil period of British politics since the war. No, I mean, that obviously, they called a referendum for cynical partisan reasons, which was to assuage the backbenches of the Conservative Party and try and diffuse the political threat of UKIP to many Tory MPs. They messed up the referendum because it was a referendum about immigration, let's just be clear. Mostly it was. And David Cameron spent years portraying immigration as a big problem that had to be dealt with. He gave promises that could never be kept on limiting, on capping immigrant numbers to the tens of thousands. Ended up being hundreds of thousands still.
But that's where we are now, and Labour might inherit this. That's
no,
what I'm trying to get you on. I get your points about the Tories, but where's Labour on this?
But the reason that's important to say that is it's about Labour clearing up the Tories' mess, because for the last few years under the Tories, all they ever said was, we're clearing up Labour's mess about a financial crisis that was not caused by the Labour Party. Sure, there wasn't proper regulation of banks, but the Tories wanted even less regulation. It was a global financial crash. Cynically, they argued it was due to Labour overspending, even though they backed every single penny of Labour spending. On Labour's position, though, obviously Labour has a uniquely difficult political problem because its electoral coalition includes Hackney and Hull. 80% of Hackney voted to remain in the European Union. It's a Labour stronghold. 70% of Hull voted to leave. Another Labour stronghold. And many of those people in London, in Manchester, in Birmingham and elsewhere, Liverpool, particularly younger voters, hate this. They think this is a national calamity of an unprecedented scale since the end of the war. And other voters, particularly relatively older voters, and it wasn't just, a majority, we should be clear, of working class people under 35 voted to remain, a majority of middle class people over 65 voted to leave. So it's more complicated than class and age and all the rest. But there are diverging views on this by Labour voters. And actually, I think Labour have tried to walk a tightrope on this, which was to accept a result, which I personally think is very bad for the country. But at the end of the day, we did lose that referendum, which was a tawdry referendum full of lies and bigotry. I understand all that. I understand all the objections. Lots of votes and elections are, unfortunately. And now the issue is, how do you make the best of it? Now, what Labour argued for, and they've and it has been about trying to evolve and shift as a position, because it's a mess. It's an epic national mess. No point pretending otherwise. But to have a transitional period of about 4 years to stay in the single market and the customs union, the Tories have already moved towards that, of course. That was what the only thing that came out of that Florence speech the other week. But my own view is, on the second referendum, the problem is, what happens if Remain win by 52%? Do we say to the Brexiteers, you can't have a referendum again? Is it best of three? And it's a genuine problem. If people say to me all the time, they say, if it was 52% last year, Nigel Farage, he'd be calling for a second referendum. Of course he would.
But he made that clear, actually.
What would we say to him, though? We'd say no chance. Absolutely no chance. We had a referendum and you lost. And I think the problem we have now is that a lot of people voted the way they did because they felt fed up with democracy and not being represented and being ignored. I worry about the democratic chaos that would be unleashed. That said, if it was overturned, that is, that said, if there is a very clear, decisive shift in public opinion, then I think we should obviously reconsider it. But at the moment, there isn't much evidence of it. There was a YouGov poll a couple of weeks ago. Do you know what the result was? The polling, it was 48% Remain, 52% Leave. And I just don't think there's been a decisive shift. And I think even arguing at the moment, I mean, it's different in London because London voted to Remain. But I found myself, if you make the case for a second referendum, it antagonises people. My worry is with some people who voted Remain, and I do think it's a minority, it is a small minority of people who voted Remain, treating people as though they were stupid and thick and ill-educated is not the charm offensive, certainly, that is going to win them over. And if people do want to win people over, and that is, we're in a democracy, if people want to campaign for a second referendum, why shouldn't they? But they do need a different strategy, those people, rather than going, it was only an advisory referendum, that keeps coming up. The government said, we will honour this result. So did the opposition. No one thought it was an advisory referendum in reality. If they go around saying, people are stupid, they're ill-informed, they don't have the capacity to make a decision on such an important issue, I don't think that's going to win people over. I think they should say, look, I understand why you voted the way you did. This isn't working. It's causing chaos. We should reevaluate the situation. I haven't seen much evidence of that, and I think on both sides you either get, the right-wing tabloids saying enemies of the people, crush the saboteurs, and all the rest of it. One, that High Court judge who's called a gay ex-Olympic fencer. I don't know what that had to do with anything. And that's what they said. That's what they wrote about it. No, and you get that, and then you get some people who go, these are thick, bigoted racists who are stupid and destroyed the country. We need to find a way to bridge the gap between people who voted Remain and Leave, who on many issues from the NHS to tax to public ownership are on the same page. On this issue, clearly they're not. It's a cultural war in lots of ways. And I think we need to find ways of diffusing that cultural war. That will mean a lot of people on the Remain side biting their tongue a bit in the face of the way the Sun and the Mail and the Express and the rest are behaving, and the Telegraph. But nonetheless, we have to find a way of uniting this country on the key issues that actually I think we're in danger of forgetting if we just talk about Brexit for the next 10 years and nothing else. And I think until there's a big shift in public opinion, making the case for a second referendum will antagonise people, it won't win people over. But if public opinion changes, of course, people should reevaluate it.
Right, time for one or two more questions. There was a lady there who... Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yep, very well, loud and clear.
I think you've got some oldies here tonight because I joined the party in 56 as well.
Well, another round of applause. 56. Blimey.
I was going to ask you, having been a critic of Jeremy Corbyn, when did you change your mind?
Well, I voted for Jeremy in both leadership elections, and I campaigned for him to become leader in the first place. And in fact, I threw everything into that campaign. I went around the country backing him in rallies. I used social media, my Guardian. I mean, I was pretty much the only mainstream commentator at the time to back him. On TV, all the rest. I did end up not losing faith. I always believed in the policies and the ideas. But I thought there was a very big danger, obviously, of a snap general election, which happened. And Labour was so behind in the polling at the time, whether it be not just the overall polling, Labour was on 24%, the Conservatives were on 48%. Labour had lost the by-election, where the underlying who do you prefer as Prime Minister, Jeremy Corbyn was on 12%, Theresa May was on 60%. And there was no historical precedent for turning that around at all. And in fact, the polling traditionally, this is the first election in history where the polling has in any significant way underestimated Labour. There's no precedent for that. As we saw in 2015, where polling is wrong, it's normally in the favour of the Conservatives. So my fear was there'd be a snap general election, and if Labour suffered a calamitous defeat, then the socialism that I believe in would be buried in an electoral apocalypse and would never recover ever again. So that's why I suggested that if they didn't think they could turn it around, somebody else with the same opinion should take over. That was completely and utterly wrong, quite clearly. Completely wrong. And the reason it was wrong is what I didn't foresee, was that if you had an inspiring vision and policies, particularly which tapped into things which haven't been said in British politics for a long time, it will turn things around and inspire people. And I did throw everything into that general election. I was again, without getting a little violin out, trying to big myself up, but again, I was pretty much one of the only newspaper columnists that unapologetically in that general election, whether it be in my column or on TV, make the case for Jeremy Corbyn to become Prime Minister and for Labour to win and to back all those policies, because even people who are anti-Tory didn't agree with the policies. They thought they were wrong, they thought they were radical, they thought they were extreme. For me, that manifesto was the big turning point, because my fear before that was actually it wasn't particularly radical what was being offered before at all. We didn't have an offer of public ownership of energy and the utilities and taxes on the top 5%. So my worry was we'd go down in a catastrophic defeat without even offering something that was particularly different. But what changed, and I saw it, because I threw everything into that general election, was knocking on doors and trying to get people to knock on doors and encourage people to register, to talk to their grandparents and all the rest. Those policies and those ideas and that vision changed everything. And that's what turned it around. And that for me was a life lesson, because I think I felt a bit lost. I wasn't the only one, but I definitely felt a bit lost politically in terms of the strategy, not the ideas or the policies, but that it showed that if you have a genuine radical vision that offers a compelling alternative to how things are, you can turn things around. And that's what's happened, and that's why we will end up with a strong and stable government under Jeremy Corbyn, which will nationalise the energy and rail and water and abolish tuition fees and end in-work poverty and tax the rich and the big companies and the banks and invest in our economy. And I have to say this, Thatcher and Attlee transformed Britain, one for the worse, one for the better, and this coming government, and you're all going to be part of it, is going to transform this country in a way which will be, I think, a beacon for much of the rest of the world. And I think people who are part of that should be very proud of what they've done.
And we're pretty much out of time. Just one final thought. I mean, that was a very optimistic thought, obviously, and you've been optimistic about a lot of things.
Also pessimistic,
but you've also managed to be pessimistic and say the country is in a terrible state in various ways. You travel around a lot. You know what happened in Germany. Alternative for Deutschland did extremely well. You know what's happening in Spain. I take it you're not a fan of Trump. We haven't really discussed him, but we haven't got a whole night. So, but I mean, why the sense of optimism? Because another possibility is that the populist wave that you dislike will continue.
Well, actually, that links to what that last question said, because it's become abundantly clear to me in the last year that it's them or us. The old order of economic liberalism, of the free market, of neoliberalism, whatever you want to call it, embraced by social democratic parties and parties of the right, has failed fundamentally. It's been rejected. And it's left a vacuum which is being filled either, not exclusively, because you've got in Scotland and Catalonia civic nationalist movements that tapped into that discontent. But what you've seen are either xenophobic right-wing populist and authoritarian movements which say you are struggling and the system is broken and life's going to get harder for you unless we blame these immigrants and we kick them out, and the Muslims and the people at the bottom of society, or, and that's the National Front in France, it's the Austrian far right who are now going to be kingmakers, who nearly became head of state for the first time since Hitler, let's not forget last year, whether it be in Sweden, the Swedish Democrats who came out of the neo-Nazi white supremacist movement, whether it be the Golden Dawn in Greece, or it's the Bernie Sanders, or Donald Trump, of course, on the other hand, that's the biggie, isn't it? The Donald Trump in America. On the other hand, the Bernie Sanders movement, or Podemos in Spain, a left party which in the space of a few months became one of the three main parties in Spain. Whether it be, obviously, what's happened in Britain, whether it be in other parts of Europe as well. Syriza was punished because Greece was expendable, but they did rise because of that discontent. it's very clear to me that after the defeat of Hillary Clinton, who exemplified the old third-way centrism, mixed social and economic liberalism, and it was against a candidate who people thought it was more likely that an asteroid hitting Earth would happen rather than him becoming president. Yes, he lost the popular vote, we know that, but the idea Donald Trump is president of the United States, that form of politics, and I know she faced misogyny and all the rest, I'm not discounting that, of course, but the fact is that old form of politics, which dominated the Western world in the 90s and the noughties, is dead. And unless the left wins and succeeds and meets people's discontent and anger with positive, optimistic solutions to change society in the interest of the majority, it will be the Donald Trumps and the Nigel Farages and the Marine Le Pens and the Austrian far right. They will benefit. And we learned that from the 1930s in an even more extreme and crude way. And look what happened to the continent of Europe. So now for me, it's clearer than ever that only a genuine radical left alternative offers a solution to the growing insecurities and fears, and the only way of defeating the far-right populists and xenophobes and quasi-fascists or outright fascists in some ways is to offer a genuine, inspiring vision that says don't blame your neighbour, take on those at the top and build a society in the interest of the majority. And that now is the challenge that faces the Western world. And it's not yet clear who'll win, but what this election showed this year in Britain, and it has given a lot of hope to people across Europe, incidentally, and America, is maybe, just maybe, if you offer that alternative, then people will flock to it. And that's got to be the future.
Well, I'm afraid we've run out of time, but I hope some of you will join us for our next In Conversation, which is with Francesca Simon at the weekend. There's also be some people with some shaking buckets on the way out, should you feel you wish to contribute more to the Kent Opportunities Fund. But finally, a big thanks to all of you for coming, and to our amazing
And to Gavin,
guest.
give him a big round of applause. Big round of applause to Gavin.
Thank you for watching the recording for this event. Remember, you can watch more recordings of In Conversation on our YouTube page. In Conversation supports the Kent Opportunity Fund. For more information, visit www.kent.ac.uk/giving.